The elite world of high fashion and private equity does not operate on artistic inspiration or genuine human sentiment. It functions as a highly calculated transactional matrix where human emotions are treated as liquid assets to be traded for social dominance and corporate leverage. I stood in the center of my darkened Milanese atelier surrounded by rows of ivory silk, mannequins that looked like pale ghosts waiting for an execution. My hands were trembling as I pinned the final layers of a midnight black lace gown designed for the upcoming seasonal gala. Maxmillian Vance stood near the arched marble entrance of the studio, his presence dominating the silent space like an unyielding shadow while the rain beat a rhythmic, agonizing cadence against the glass dome above us. He did not offer a single word of romantic validation. He simply placed a customized velvet box on the mahogany table containing a flawless 10-carat emerald engagement ring that represented a legal merge between his global shipping conglomerate and my family's struggling textile empire. I looked into his cold, aristocratic eyes and tried to convince my fractured mind that this calculated arrangement was the ultimate sanctuary. I needed to escape the recurring nightmares of the Alpine accident that had wiped out my youth. But when I stepped back toward the mirror, I noticed a single red thread woven into the hem of my dress. A deliberate, terrifying signature left by Dmitry Sokolov, the enigmatic art appraiser who had arrived in the city only 48 hours ago, carrying an unsigned portrait of my dead twin sister. Asterisk. True psychological distress does not arrive with a dramatic theatrical confrontation. It introduces itself as a soft whisper inside an elite social sanctuary, where you are forced to maintain a mask of complete aristocratic composure. The annual charity auction at the Palazzo Sabelloni was crowded with international billionaires, media tycoons, and high society predators who measured their personal worth by the placement of their seating arrangements. Maxmillian sat beside me, his large hand resting on my bare shoulder with a heavy, protective possessiveness that felt more like a golden cage than a gesture of affection. Camila Silva approached our table with a sharp, predatory smile, her diamonds catching the light as she introduced Dmitry Sokolov as the guest curator of the evening's modern art collection. Dmitry stepped forward, his eyes locking onto mine with an intense, unblinking recognition that sent a physical wave of panic through my entire nervous system. He unveiled the central piece of the auction, a devastating canvas depicting a woman drowning in a sea of white linen. A painting that used the exact proprietary dye formula that only my sister and I knew how to manufacture before the accident. I felt the oxygen leave my lungs as Dmitry looked directly at Maxmillian and stated that the painting had been recovered from a private storage facility in Zurich 3 months after my sister's funeral, forcing me to realize that the history I had been given by my family was an absolute, systemic lie. Asterisk. The actual finality of a romantic illusion occurs when you discover that your entire domestic sanctuary has been mapped, monitored and maintained by the person you trusted to protect your sanity. Maxmillian had departed for an emergency boardroom meeting in London, leaving me alone inside his sprawling, high-security villa on the outskirts of Lake Como. I guided my steps toward the subterranean library, driven by an uncontrollable analytical impulse to locate the origin of the Zurich painting. My fingers brushed against a hidden biometric panel behind a row of ancient leather-bound ledgers, releasing a heavy steel door that led into a temperature-controlled archival room. The space did not contain corporate financial records or maritime asset tracking maps. It was filled with hundreds of high-resolution photographs of my life spanning the last 7 years, detailed neurological profiles, and the original police transcripts from the Alpine crash. At the bottom of the central steel container lay an unopened letter written in my sister's distinct handwriting, addressed directly to Maxmillian Vance on the eve of her death, begging him to systematically eliminate my memory if the survival protocol failed. I stood in the silent, cold dark of the vault, my heart hammering against my ribs as I realized the man I was about to marry had not entered my life by a beautiful twist of fate. He had been the architect of my isolation from the very beginning. Asterisk. When the psychological foundation of your life is completely demolished by a tactical betrayal, you do not wait for an executive explanation. You cut the corporate threads and run toward the only individual who promises to reveal the raw architecture of your past. I left the emerald ring on the cold steel desk inside Maxmillian's secret vault, packed a single briefcase with my original textile sketches, and boarded the midnight express train to Paris without notifying my assistant or the atelier board. Dimitri was waiting for me at a small, dimly lit cafe near the banks of the Seine, his bohemian attire contrasting sharply with the rigid luxury I had been conditioned to endure for the past 5 years. He reached across the wooden table, his fingers wrapping around my cold, trembling hands with a desperate, authentic warmth that felt like the first breath of pure oxygen after a long suffocation. He promised me that in Paris I would no longer have to be the silent puppet of the Vance empire. We retreated to his chaotic, canvas-filled loft in the Montmartre district where the smell of oil paint and rain created a dangerous, intoxicating atmosphere of creative liberation, as he pulled me into a fierce, breathless kiss that tasted of freedom and forbiddance longing. My eyes drifted to a locked drawer beneath his workstation where a discarded corporate badge from the silver media empire lay half hidden beneath a stack of old sketches, delivering the first terrifying warning that my romantic savior was running a highly complex operation of his own. Asterisk. The illusion of absolute creative liberation. Inside a bohemian sanctuary decays the exact moment you realize the financial metrics of the global luxury market are controlled by the very entity you are attempting to escape. I sat on the edge of the unmade bed in the Montmartre loft, watching the morning sun cut through the dusty windows to illuminate the chaotic sea of oil paintings while Dimitri slept beside me. My phone vibrated silently on the floor, displaying 42 missed calls from the Milanese atelier and a single, unredacted text message from Maxmillian Vance, containing a digital copy of a foreclosure directive against my family's historic silk mills in Como. He did not threaten my physical safety, and he did not utilize aggressive emotional rhetoric. He simply presented the cold computational reality that without his institutional liquidity, my creative legacy would be liquidated by the end of the business week. I stepped away from the bed, my fingers accidentally knocking against the locked drawer beneath Dimitri's workstation, causing the wooden panel to slide open slightly, to reveal not just a corporate badge from the silver media empire, but a comprehensive financial ledger, detailing a sequence of high-volume wire transfers from Camilla Silva's private offshore account directly to Dimitri's personal gallery network. I stood frozen in the cold morning air, realizing that my desperate flight to Paris was not an act of independent rebellion, but a carefully choreographed migration designed by my enemies to permanently detach me from the protection of the Vance empire. Asterisk. True psychological warfare is executed when you are forced to attend a high society media exhibition alongside the person who is actively dismantling your sanity while pretending to be your ultimate romantic protector. The grand opening of the Galerie d'Orsay was a masterclass in superficial cultural sophistication, filled with international critics, fashion editors, and members of the European elite who whispered about my sudden disappearance from Milan. Dimitri walked by my side, his hand resting on the small of my back with an intense, performative tenderness that felt increasingly like a physical threat. Camilla Silva appeared from the crowd dressed in an immaculate cream wool suit, her eyes glittering with tactical triumph as she congratulated Dimitri on securing the exclusive rights to display my dead sister's unpublished sketches. I looked at the gallery walls, seeing my own childhood memories framed and commodified for public consumption. Before I could execute a retreat, the heavy glass doors of the entrance opened to reveal Maxmillian Vance, His towering frame clad in a dark bespoke coat, the absolute confrontation between a protective warden and a calculated deceiver does not resolve itself through physical violence. It settles within the freezing subtext of a non-negotiable business transaction. Maxmillian stopped exactly 3 feet from Dimitri, ignoring his rival's mocking smile to look down at me with an intense, demanding gaze that held no anger, only an absolute certainty of my compliance. He slid a certified asset transfer document onto the marble display counter, announcing that he had officially purchased the entire historical debt of the Galerie d'Orsay within the last 2 hours, effectively rendering himself Dimitri's primary landlord and executive supervisor. He looked at Dimitri and stated that any further attempt to display or distribute my sister's legacy without explicit authorization from the Vance estate would result in an immediate international injunction and the total liquidation of his entire artistic portfolio. Dimitri's face turned an ashen grey as his bohemian mask completely dissolved to reveal the desperate, cornered operator underneath, while Maxmillian extended his hand toward me, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper, telling me that the game in Paris was over, and it was time to return to the architecture we had built together. Asterisk. When you return to the geographical origin of your deepest psychological trauma, you realize that the walls of your sanctuary are constructed from the exact same materials as the walls of your prison. I sat in the rear seat of Maxmillian's private vehicle as we navigated the winding, narrow cliffs overlooking Lake Como, the dark water below reflecting the moonlight like a vast sheet of polished obsidian. We entered the iron gates of his lakeside villa in absolute silence, a silence that carried the crushing weight of 7 years of unspoken secrets. Maxmillian guided me into his primary study, closing the heavy oak doors to seal us away from the staff and the external world. He did not demand an apology for my flight to Paris, and he did not mention the emerald ring I had left behind. He simply poured 2 glasses of mineral water, sat across from me at the massive mahogany table, and turned on a vintage reel-to-reel tape recorder that had been recovered from the wreckage of the Alpine crash, letting the actual voice of my dead sister fill the room to dismantle the final illusions of my memory. Asterisk. The ultimate devastation of a human heart occurs when the ghost of the person you loved most in the world returns via a digital audio recording to confess that she was the one who engineered your destruction. The sound of my twin sister's voice emerged through the static of the old tape, her tone laced with a manic, desperate jealousy that I had never permitted myself to recognize during our youth. She was speaking to an unknown third party, offering to sell the proprietary chemical formulas of our family's silk mills to the silver conglomerate in exchange for a permanent escape to South America. She explicitly detailed how she was going to drug my wine on the night of our Alpine journey to ensure I would be incapacitated while she executed the asset theft. The recording cut out with the sound of screeching tires and a violent physical impact, leaving the study in a state of suffocating, petrified silence. I looked across the table at Maxmillian, my vision blurring with tears of absolute horror as he quietly explained that he had spent the last 7 years buying up every piece of evidence, every corrupted ledger, and every archive to ensure I would never have to find out that my sister died trying to erase me. Asterisk. The fourth wall breaks. Saraphina Rossi appears standing at the head of a massive, illuminated cutting table inside her Milanese atelier, looking directly into the camera lens while assistants silently roll out bolts of heavy black silk behind her. Most traditional romance novels condition you to believe that love is a soft, fragile emotion driven by destiny, shared vulnerabilities, and superficial declarations of passion. They do not understand that in the highest tier of the social architecture, true love is a defensive military alliance constructed from shared secrets, absolute survival metrics, and the willingness to carry a crushing psychological weight for another person without ever demanding their gratitude. Maximilian Vance did not lock me in a cage because he was a cold corporate dictator. He locked me in a cage because the world outside was filled with predators like Dimitri and Camila, who wanted to dig up my sister's corpse, to weaponize her crimes against my legacy. Now that the code of my past has been completely decrypted, I am no longer the broken victim running through the rain of Paris. I am the co-architect of this empire, and we are about to execute a permanent system purge against anyone who tried to profit from our silence. Asterisk. The reconstruction of a shattered, psychological foundation requires an absolute, unyielding commitment to corporate retaliation. I sat at the head of the polished obsidian conference table in our newly consolidated Milanese headquarters. The early morning light cutting through the blinds to cast long, cage-like shadows across the floor. Maxmillian stood at my right hand, his fingers resting lightly on the back of my leather chair to signal an unbroken front to the assembly of nervous minority shareholders. We were reviewing the market data of the silver media conglomerate, tracking the subtle, malicious fluctuations in their quarterly advertising revenue to locate the exact vulnerability we needed to exploit. Camila Silva had built her entire social dynasty on the illusion of unassailable moral purity and high society tastemaking. But our financial intelligence team had just uncovered a massive network of shell companies in Panama used to funnel illicit cultural subsidies directly into her private publishing houses. I looked at the digital display, my heart rate remaining flawlessly steady as I authorized a massive, aggressive short position against the silver stock, realizing that the best way to honor my sister's memory was not to weep for her betrayal, but to systematically dismantle the global entity that had corrupted her ambition. Asterisk. True emotional intimacy between two highly guarded individuals does not develop through conventional romantic dates. It solidifies during the midnight execution of a high-stakes corporate ambush. We walked through the historic cobblestone alleys of the Brera district, our footsteps echoing against the ancient stone walls, as we made our way toward an underground printing facility that Camila used to distribute her elite lifestyle magazines. Maxmillian kept his eyes scanned on the perimeter, his arm brushing against mine with a quiet, grounding heat that felt far more reassuring than any superficial declaration of love. We entered the facility using a master security key obtained from an inside asset, the air thick with the heavy scent of fresh ink and industrial lubricants. We located the master printing plates for the upcoming September issue, an issue that contained a highly destructive, falsified expose on my family's textile heritage. Maxmillian reached into his coat, extracted an encrypted data drive, and bypassed the main console network within 4 minutes, replacing the malicious editorial text with the verified financial records of Camila's Panama transactions. He turned to me in the dim light of the press room, his lips parting into a rare, dangerous smile as he whispered that by sunrise, Camila would be forced to read her own corporate obituary on her own proprietary paper. Asterisk. When your enemy realizes they are being systematically outmaneuvered on their own territory, their desperation causes them to execute highly erratic, dangerous tactical maneuvers. I received an encrypted emergency transmission from our private banking repository in Zurich, stating that Dmitry Sokolov had attempted to utilize a forged power of attorney to withdraw the remaining unreleased sketches of my twin sister from the high-security vault. Maxmillian and I boarded his private jet within 30 minutes, the flight across the Alps passing in a state of tense, hyper-focused synchronization as we mapped out our counterstrike. We arrived at the Zurich banking pavilion just as the afternoon snow began to blanket the city, finding Dmitry in the private viewing room, surrounded by security guards and holding the fragile, historic canvases that contained our family's proprietary silk dye formulas. I stepped into the room, my voice carrying an absolute, regal authority that instantly froze the bank executives. I looked at Dmitri and presented the certified legal documentation proving his power of attorney had been permanently revoked by the Italian courts 2 hours prior, effectively transforming his desperate art retrieval into a flagrant act of international grand larceny. We returned to the villa in Lake Como as the winter storms began to settle over the mountains, the vast body of water below turning a deep, impenetrable shade of iron grey. We sat by the massive stone fireplace in the main salon, the crackling of the wood the only sound disrupting the profound peace of the estate. I held my sister's original sketches in my lap, tracing the intricate, beautiful lines of her early textile concepts with a sense of grief that had finally been purified of anger and confusion. Maxmillian approached from behind, carrying 2 cups of dark tea, and sat on the leather sofa beside me without demanding any emotional performance. I leaned my head against his shoulder, letting the heavy, steady rhythm of his breathing anchor me to the present moment, realizing that our love was not born from a beautiful, unblemished fairy tale, but forged in the absolute white heat of survival, betrayal, and systemic victory over the ghosts of our past. The global luxury market does not tolerate a vacuum of power, and our victory over Dmitry Sokolov instantly triggered an aggressive, protectionist response from the remaining old guard dynasties of European fashion. I spent 3 days inside our production facility in Como, working alongside the master weavers to recalibrate the mechanized looms for our upcoming winter collection, a collection that relied entirely on our newly recovered proprietary dye formulas. A sudden administrative order arrived from the European Customs Union, declaring our specialized raw silk imports from Asia, held under a temporary embargo due to an anonymous allegation of supply chain ethical violations. I knew instantly that this was Camilla Silva's parting counterattack, an attempt to choke our manufacturing capability before our designs could reach the Milanese runways. Maxmillian arrived at the factory floor within the hour, his face unreadable but his posture radiating an intense, combative energy as he pulled out his global logistics tracking terminal to launch a counter-embargo against Camilla's South American shipping corridors. To break a politically motivated trade embargo, you do not file administrative appeals. You confront the state regulators at their own private social gatherings. We attended the diplomatic reception at the French embassy in Milan. A sea of silk ties, military medals, and whispered corporate alliances. Camilla Silva was standing near the grand ice sculpture in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by regional trade ministers who smiled at her calculated charms. I walked directly into her circle, my black velvet gown drawing the immediate attention of the photographers, while Maxmillian engaged the Minister of Commerce in a private conversation near the terrace. I looked at Camilla, my voice smooth and lethal as I whispered that her offshore asset accounts in Panama had already been mirrored to the internal compliance database of the Italian tax authority. She tried to maintain her aristocratic composure, but the slight tremor in her champagne glass betrayed her total awareness that her entire media empire was one keystroke away from federal seizure. The execution of a systemic financial liquidation requires you to strike your opponent's primary revenue streams simultaneously across multiple time zones. By midnight, as the embassy gala was drawing to a close, the international markets opened in New York, and our coordinated short position against the Silva Media Group began to manifest its absolute, devastating momentum. Institutional investors began dumping their shares in massive volumes as the leaked Panama documents began appearing on the financial news networks. Camilla received an urgent call on her satellite device, her face draining of all color as she listened to her chief financial officer explain that their corporate credit rating had just been downgraded to junk status. She looked across the crowded ballroom at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pure hatred and dawning terror, realizing that the quiet textile designer she had tried to destroy had just permanently severed her access to the global capital markets. Asterisk. The final execution of a corporate dynasty does not take place in a court of law. It is completed inside an airless corporate boardroom, where the directors vote to save their own personal fortunes at the expense of their leader. Maxmillian and I walked into the Silver Media Group headquarters at 9 o'clock the following morning, having purchased 42% of their distressed voting bonds over the weekend. The board of directors sat in absolute, terrified silence as we took our places at the end of the mahogany table. Camilla sat at the opposite end, her hair immaculate, but her eyes showing the profound exhaustion of a fallen queen. Maxmillian presented the formal restructuring mandate, demanding her immediate resignation from the executive board and the total surrender of her voting shares to the Vance Rossi Trust. Her own board members voted unanimously to approve the transition within 6 minutes, leaving her completely isolated in the empire her family had spent 40 years constructing. Asterisk. The fourth wall breaks. Saraphina Rossi appears standing before an enormous digital printing array inside her production facility, the machine rapidly producing miles of midnight black silk fabric that glows with an iridescent, dark violet luster under the industrial lights. The superficial high society world believes that power is an inherent right passed down through family crests, luxury titles, and mainstream media dominance. They do not understand that true power is an engineered commodity that belongs exclusively to those who can control the raw materials of production and the strategic velocity of capital. Camilla Silva believed she could use her media empire to rewrite my past and turn my trauma into a public spectacle for her own financial gain. She failed to realize that when you strip away the lights, the cameras, and the public relations campaigns, a media conglomerate is just a collection of debts waiting to be collected by a stronger architect. We have cleared the field of our primary adversaries. Our manufacturing lines are running at maximum capacity, and our runtime environment is now completely sovereign. Asterisk. The immediate aftermath of a total market conquest often reveals a deeper, more sinister layer of systemic corruption hidden within the international banking networks. 2 weeks after the liquidation of the Silver Media Group, an anonymous courier delivered an encrypted diplomatic pouch to our Milanese residence, containing a series of highly sensitive transaction logs from a private wealth management firm in Geneva. The logs indicated that someone had been systematically purchasing the historic land titles surrounding my family's silk mills in Como for the past 3 years using a blind trust titled Hyperion Zero. I reviewed the cryptographic signatures with Maxmillian. Our initial assumption that Camilla was the sole instigator of our troubles completely shattering as we realized a massive, institutional third party had been orchestrating the destruction of our heritage from the absolute shadows of the Swiss financial district. Asterisk. To trace an anonymous, institutional adversary, you must leave the comfort of your metropolitan offices and venture into the high-altitude sanctuaries where the global elite hide their sovereign assets. Maxmillian and I traveled to a secluded luxury resort in St. Moritz under the guise of a winter holiday, our real objective being a private dinner meeting with an elderly Swiss land registrar who held the unredacted ownership records of the Como territory. The mountain air was piercingly cold, the snow drifts outside our timber cabin, creating an intense sense of isolation that mirrored our internal state of hypervigilance. We met the registrar in a secluded corner of the resort's private library, where he presented a historical deed showing that Hyperion Zero was managed by Liam O'Connor, a senior federal investigator who had supposedly been leading the official inquiry into my twin sister's Alpine crash 7 years ago. Asterisk. The true horror of a systemic betrayal manifests when you realize that the public official assigned to investigate your family's trauma was actually the primary, economic beneficiary of the crime. We returned to our cabin to find our internal security network completely offline. The lights extinguished and the fire in the hearth reduced to cold grey ashes. Liam O'Connor was sitting in the darkness near the window, a glass of our private vintage in his hand and a cold, administrative smile on his weathered face. He did not draw a weapon, knowing that Maxmillian's personal security detachment was monitoring the exterior. But he presented a classified federal warrant, authorizing the immediate seizure of all my sister's recovered sketches under the pretense of an ongoing international national security investigation, forcing us to realize that he was trying to use the authority of the state to finalize the asset theft my sister had failed to execute. True executive authority does not capitulate to bureaucratic extortion. It utilizes superior macroeconomic leverage to crush the administrative framework of the extortionist. Maxmillian stepped forward into the dim light, his voice carrying a resonant, iron-like finality that instantly changed the psychological dynamic of the room. He informed O'Connor that his private maritime shipping network had already suspended all commercial freight operations at 3 major ports managed by O'Connor's political backers in Ireland, creating a $20 million a day supply chain crisis that would force his administrative supervisors to dismiss him before the end of the week. O'Connor's confident smile completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, calculating panic as he realized that Maxmillian was entirely willing to disrupt international commerce to protect my creative sovereignty. The departure from a high-altitude conflict zone requires a clean, decisive execution that leaves no room for administrative recourse. O'Connor slowly placed the federal warrant back into his leather case, stood up from the chair, and walked out of our cabin into the freezing mountain night without uttering another word of bureaucratic defiance. Knowing his career was effectively terminated, Maxmillian turned to me, his hands reaching out to wrap me in his heavy wool coat, as he checked my biometrics to ensure my stress levels remained within safe parameters. We boarded our transport vehicle back to Milan before dawn, watching the jagged white peaks of the Alps recede into the grey morning mist. Knowing that we had finally severed the last official tentacle of the conspiracy that had haunted our lives for a decade. The approaching date of the Milan Fashion Week demanded our absolute, uninterrupted focus on the physical manifestation of our winter collection. I spent 48 consecutive hours inside the design studio, working alongside my pattern makers to finalize the architectural structure of our primary evening gowns. We were utilizing a revolutionary new weaving technique that blended traditional silk threads with microscopic filaments of conductive carbon, creating a fabric that dynamically shifted its luster based on the ambient light of the environment. A physical metaphor for our own survival through the dark matrices of the corporate world. Maxmillian remained in the adjoining executive office, his terminal arrays humming as he managed the global distribution logistics to ensure our collection would launch simultaneously in Tokyo, London, and New York. The presentation of a Haute Couture collection is not a superficial display of decorative luxury. It is a public tribunal where the designer uses art to deliver a non-negotiable statement of cultural and financial dominance. The Grand Salon of the Teatro alla Scala was filled to maximum capacity with the most powerful figures in global culture, media, and finance. The lights in the theatre dropped to absolute blackness. A single cello beginning to play a haunting, minimalistic melody that echoed the static of the Alpine tape recording. Our models stepped onto the runway dressed in breathtaking garments of midnight black and deep iridescent violet, their movements synchronized and powerful. The final gown, worn by a model who bore a striking resemblance to my youth, was a masterpiece of pure unredacted silk that captured the light like a star collapsing into a black hole, stunning the audience into a state of absolute, petrified silence. The immediate reaction of the international press to our runway presentation confirmed that we had permanently shifted the aesthetic paradigm of the global fashion industry. The applause inside the theatre lasted for 11 continuous minutes. The critics declaring the collection an absolute triumph of emotional raw power and technical innovation. Maxmillian met me at the edge of the stage, his eyes reflecting a profound, authentic pride that I had never seen in him before. He guided me through the sea of congratulatory journalists and international buyers, his hand resting securely against the small of my back to anchor me through the overwhelming noise of our victory. As we stepped into the private VIP reception room, our chief operating officer presented the real-time sales data, showing that the collection had secured over $80 million in wholesale orders within the first 20 minutes of its release. True security is achieved when you have converted your creative talent into an unassailable, financial fortress that no external conspiracy can penetrate. We retreated to our private apartment on the top floor of the Palazzo Rossi, leaving the high society celebrations behind us to enjoy a moment of absolute, uncompromised privacy. We sat on the balcony overlooking the illuminated spires of the Duomo, the cool night air clearing our minds of the lingering adrenaline of the conflict. Maxmillian reached into his pocket and placed the emerald engagement ring back onto my finger, his voice dropping to a low, tender frequency as he stated that our arrangement was no longer a corporate transaction managed by lawyers, but a permanent, sovereign covenant between two equals who had conquered their demons together. The modern world is obsessed with the concept of transparency, believing that if you expose every detail of your life to the public view, you will somehow achieve validation and happiness. They do not understand that the ultimate luxury of existence is the absolute capacity for silence and strategic invisibility. We have successfully purged our corporate network of every hostile variable, reconstructed our family heritage from the ashes of betrayal, and established a financial ecosystem that operates entirely beyond the reach of our competitors. The first half of our journey is complete. The ledger has been balanced, and our runtime environment is now completely flawless. The absolute stability of an empire is an illusion that can be instantly shattered by the emergence of a historical ghost that was assumed to be permanently compiled. 3 months after our runway triumph in Milan, our global intelligence monitors detected a massive, uncoordinated influx of venture capital into a newly registered biotechnology firm in Edinburgh called Hyperion Regeneration. The firm had quietly acquired the intellectual property rights to the neurological suppression drugs that were used on me during my convalescence after the Alpine crash. I sat at my design terminal, my fingers freezing over the touch interface as I realized that Liam O'Connor's political handlers had not accepted defeat. They had simply mutated their strategy from a territorial land grab into a systemic attempt to control the biological data of my trauma. To neutralize a biological threat to your personal sovereignty, you must walk directly into the geographical territory where the research is being weaponized. Maxmillian and I arrived at his ancestral estate in the Scottish Highlands, a massive stone fortress surrounded by black lochs and mist-covered moors that looked like a landscape drawn from an ancient myth. The atmosphere was thick with a heavy ancestral cold that seemed to slow down the perception of time itself. We established a tactical operations center inside the castle's vaulted armory, utilizing a localized satellite network to intercept the internal communications of the Edinburgh laboratory. Discovering that the lead scientist directing the neurological project was Dr. Elena Rossi, my father's estranged younger sister who had disappeared from Italy 25 years ago. The confrontation with a rogue family member requires you to strip away all emotional sentiment and operate with the cold precision of a forensic auditor. We entered the high-security clinical facility in Edinburgh under the guise of an international charity inspection, our movements monitored by armed corporate security guards who did not understand our real operational capability. Dr. Elena Rossi was standing inside the primary synthesis lab, her lab coat immaculate, but her eyes showing the distinct, hardened ambition of a scientist who had sold her ethics to the highest corporate bidder. She looked at me with a cold, mocking familiarity, stating that my memory was not a fixed historical record, but a malleable sequence of data strings that she could edit, erase, or commodify at her own personal discretion. True personal sovereignty cannot be compromised by medical blackmail or scientific intimidation. Maxmillian stepped forward, his boots echoing heavily against the sterile tile floor of the laboratory as he presented a certified copy of an international patent injunction that he had secured through the World Intellectual Property Organization over the weekend. He informed Elena that his private equity firm had just purchased the primary manufacturing facility that produced the unique chemical precursors required for her entire neurological research line, effectively cutting off her raw materials and freezing her project within 30 seconds. Her scientific arrogance instantly collapsed into a state of pure, defensive terror as she realized that her entire career was now a subsidiary asset of the Vance estate. We left the clinical facility in Edinburgh as the winter gales began to sweep across the Scottish lowlands, the grey stone buildings of the city fading into the driving rain behind us. We returned to the security of the Highland fortress, closing the massive iron-studded doors to isolate ourselves from the external corporate static. We sat in the great hall beneath the historic banners of the Vance family, the warmth of the roaring hearth fire slowly thawing the emotional chill of our encounter with Elena. Maxmillian pulled me into his arms, his strong heart beating against my chest with a steady, unshaken permanence that reminded me that no matter how many ghosts my family threw against our architecture, we were entirely capable of rewriting our own code. The need for creative expression remains the ultimate healing mechanism for my nervous system, and my time in Scotland instantly inspired a completely new direction for our next textile collection. I began working with local Highland weavers to master the complex geometry of traditional tartans, blending the historic wool patterns with our proprietary silk formulas to create a fabric that combined the structural strength of armor with the fluid grace of water. Maxmillian watched my progress from the balcony of the weaving shed, his presence a constant, grounding force that allowed my mind to explore new creative territories without the fear of internal instability. Our collaboration transforming the ancient craft into a modern weapon of cultural warfare. The debut of our Scottish-Italian synthesis collection took place inside the Grand Gallery of the Royal Scottish Academy, an elite gathering of British royalty, European aristocrats, and international financial titans. The exhibition hall was arranged like a labyrinth of stone and silk, the models moving through the space with an intense, deliberate solemnity that captivated the audience from the first sequence. The garments reflected the raw, elemental power of the Highlands, the deep moss greens and dark blues shifting dynamically under the gallery lighting to reveal the underlying silver threads of our structural matrix, stunning the critics into a state of absolute, reverent silence that confirmed our absolute dominance over the British cultural landscape. The immediate validation of our artistic innovation by the highest tier of the social hierarchy permanently cemented our position as the premier luxury house of Europe. The artistic director of the Academy declared the collection a historical masterpiece that redefined the boundary between traditional heritage and modern, technical performance. Maxmillian escorted me through the sea of celebrating dignitaries, his hand warming mine as we accepted the formal commendations of the cultural ministers. As we reached the private reception lounge, our digital commerce monitors reported that the entire collection had been completely sold out to international museums and private collectors within 15 minutes of its presentation, securing our financial sovereignty for another era. True romantic peace is achieved when you have converted your shared struggles into an unassailable monument of personal and professional success. We slipped away from the gallery celebrations to walk along the black shores of the loch near our estate. The water perfectly still under a sky filled with 1,000,000 brilliant stars. Maxmillian stopped near an ancient stone pier, his arms wrapping around my waist from behind to hold me against the cold night wind. He whispered that he had officially transferred the entire land titles of the Como Mills and the Scottish estate into a joint, non-separable sovereign trust that belonged exclusively to our names, ensuring that our legacy would remain completely uncompromised by any future corporate generation. The superficial world believes that a relationship is a sequence of emotional negotiations driven by compromise, vulnerability, and the constant need for mutual reassurance. They do not understand that in the highest tier of existence, the ultimate romantic state is a state of absolute, unspoken architectural synchronization where two minds operate as a single system to neutralize threats and expand their domain. We have successfully decoded our past, liquidated our enemies, and established an empire that spans across the cultural capitals of the world. The final act of our compilation is about to begin, and our runtime environment is completely flawless. The ultimate test of a sovereign corporate alliance arrives when your primary economic engine is subjected to a coordinated, high-velocity physical and financial sabotage. 4 months after our Scottish triumph, our maritime logistics centres in Rotterdam reported a sudden, unexplained system lockout across our entire fleet of automated cargo vessels. The propulsion networks of 18 supertankers carrying our global textile exports were frozen mid-transit by a malicious ransomware attack signed by Hyperion Sovereign. I sat in our operations bunker, my eyes tracking the red flashing indicators on the digital maritime grid as I realized that the remnants of the Silver and Sokolov factions had pooled their remaining resources to launch a final, desperate physical embargo against our supply chain. To resolve a high-velocity maritime crisis. You do not engage in digital negotiation with anonymous extortionists. You walk directly into the control centers where the physical assets are monitored. Maxmillian and I boarded a high-speed helicopter to Rotterdam, arriving at our primary container terminal amidst a freezing maritime storm that whipped the North Sea into a fury of grey foam. We entered the main control tower to find our local IT staff in a state of absolute, paralyzed panic. Maxmillian bypassed the automated terminal manager, plugged his personal security drive directly into the main mainframe architecture, and began executing a manual override sequence that required absolute, frame-by-frame synchronization with the shipboard engineers. The execution of a digital counter-strike requires you to locate the physical origin of the signal that is disrupting your infrastructure. While Maxmillian stabilized the propulsion arrays of the fleet, I used our proprietary design algorithms to map the data packets of the ransomware, discovering that the malicious code was being broadcast from a decommissioned radar station located on a low-lying island 3 miles off the Dutch coast. We did not notify the local maritime authorities, knowing the administrative delay would cause millions in cargo spoilage. Maxmillian called in his private maritime security unit, and we boarded a high-powered interceptor boat to confront the saboteurs in their own hidden redoubt. The physical confrontation with the architects of a maritime mutiny reveals the absolute decay of your opponent's strategic capability. We breached the steel doors of the abandoned radar station under the cover of the storm, finding a team of mercenary network operators hired by Camila Silva's exiled brother, who sat surrounded by server racks and empty liquor bottles. They did not have time to initiate a data wipe before our security operators secured the terminal arrays. I stepped into the server room, my face cold and unyielding, as I extracted the master hard drives that contained the decryption keys for our fleet. while Maxmillian informed the mercenaries that their offshore payment accounts had been permanently frozen under international anti-terrorism laws. Asterisk. We stood on the concrete observation deck of the radar station as the storm began to break, watching the first of our massive cargo vessels resume its transit toward the Atlantic, its navigation lights blinking green against the dark horizon. The maritime crisis had been neutralized within 6 hours. Our global supply chain restored to absolute efficiency without a single dollar paid to the extortionists. Maxmillian reached out, his leather-gloved hand wrapping around mine to protect me from the freezing sea spray, his voice carrying a resonant, profound calm as he whispered that our architecture had officially passed its ultimate stress test, leaving us completely unassailable. The resolution of the maritime conflict provided the absolute thematic energy for our final, definitive haute couture collection, a collection that would be presented not in a traditional theatre, but inside our own automated terminal facility in Milan. I began designing garments that utilized a fusion of structural titanium ribbing and ultra-dense, non-tearable black silk satin, creating silhouettes that were both aggressively architectural and beautifully fluid. Armor for the modern aristocratic woman who operates within the high-velocity currents of global capital. Maxmillian managed the transformation of the warehouse facility, turning the industrial space into a minimalist monument of steel, glass, and light. Asterisk, the debut of the Monolithic collection marked the absolute convergence of our corporate, artistic, and romantic identities. The industrial space was filled with an elite audience of global central bankers, tech billionaires, and cultural directors who moved through the terminal under the massive, silent silhouettes of our automated cranes. The music was a powerful, rhythmic pulse that echoed the machinery of our shipping empire. The models moving along a runway constructed from reinforced glass panels suspended over a sea of glowing fiber optic cables, the garments capturing the light with a sharp, metallic precision that stunned the audience into a state of absolute breathless awe. The international reaction to the terminal exhibition confirmed that we had permanently unified the concepts of industrial power and high society luxury. The press declared the collection a visionary manifesto that shattered the traditional boundaries of fashion presentation, establishing a new paradigm for the global elite. Maxmillian met me at the center of the glass runway, his eyes reflecting an intense emotional completion as he pulled me into a rare, public embrace that signaled our absolute victory to the assembled media. Our chief financial officer presenting the real-time data showing that institutional pre-orders had exceeded $200 million within 30 minutes. Asterisk, true sovereign security is achieved when you can look down upon the entire global marketplace from a position of absolute, unchallengeable structural dominance. We returned to our private sanctuary at the Palazzo Rossi, closing the massive iron gates to enjoy a moment of complete, uninterrupted peace away from the public eye. We sat in the rooftop garden as the warm summer breeze swept over the illuminated spires of Milan. Maxmillian reached into his coat and presented a customized legal document proving that our joint venture had officially achieved complete vertical integration across all 28 nations of our operating footprint. Asterisk, the superficial world spends its entire existence attempting to balance unstable variables, driven by emotions they cannot control, memories they cannot process, and relationships that are constantly degraded by corporate and personal betrayal. They do not understand that the ultimate form of existence is to convert your entire life into a closed, high-velocity processing unit where every vulnerability is engineered into a source of structural strength. We have decoded our past, liquidated our enemies, and established an empire that operates with absolute mathematical perfection. The system is now closed, the ledger is balanced, and our runtime environment is completely flawless. Asterisk. The ultimate phase of an imperial corporate consolidation requires you to permanently immunize your infrastructure against any future regulatory or state-backed intervention. Maxmillian and I spent 3 consecutive days inside our legal vault in Milan, working alongside an elite team of international trust attorneys to draft the articles of the Rossi Sovereign Charter, a legal structure that transferred our entire global asset portfolio into a non-state judicial framework, managed exclusively by our names. This move effectively removed our shipping lines, textile mills, and intellectual property from the jurisdiction of any single nation, preventing political actors from ever using administrative maneuvers to disrupt our creative and economic sovereignty. To verify the operational autonomy of our non-state architecture, we departed the European continent to manage our global operations from our private research vessel, anchored in international waters off the coast of Malta. The ship was a masterpiece of custom marine engineering, equipped with a decentralized quantum computing array that linked directly to our automated factories and maritime fleets via a private satellite network. The deep blue horizon of the Mediterranean provided an intense sense of psychological clarity, completely separating us from the daily noise and corporate espionage of the metropolitan capitals. The execution of a permanent system purge requires you to conduct a final forensic audit of all historical adversaries to ensure their total strategic neutralization. Sitting at the primary terminal array of the vessel, I ran a comprehensive diagnostic sequence on the remaining assets of the Silver, Sokolov, and O'Connor networks, the data screens confirming that their corporate structures had been completely liquidated, their financial lines permanently severed, and their personal records securely archived within our internal compliance database, leaving them with absolute zero capability to interfere with our future runtime. ENVIRONMENTTRUE emotional and professional synchronization between two individuals is achieved when their minds operate with the same speed, precision, and clarity as the systems they have constructed. Maxmillian sat beside me at the main console, his large fingers moving across the interface to synchronize our automated production lines in Como with the distribution hubs in Tokyo, his physical presence providing a deep, constant sense of security that allowed my mind to remain flawlessly focused on the aesthetic and structural evolution of our global luxury house. The perception of time inside a sovereign environment shifts from an anxious calculation of short-term quarterly profits to a calm, expansive measurement of historical eras. We watch the sun sink beneath the calm water of the Mediterranean from the observation deck of our vessel, the sky shifting through brilliant layers of deep amber and dark violet that mirrored the colors of our signature collections. Maxmillian pulled me against his chest, his voice low and resonant as he whispered that our empire was now self-sustaining, capable of running perfectly for generations, without ever requiring a single compromise. The absolute freedom from external corporate static allowed my creative vision to expand into its final, definitive architectural form. I began developing a global design curriculum that would train the next generation of textile creators inside our private academies in Milan, Edinburgh, and Tokyo, ensuring that our proprietary dye formulas and structural weaving techniques would be preserved as a pure, unadulterated cultural legacy. Maxmillian managing the endowment of the foundations to ensure complete financial insulation from the public education systems. The presentation of our legacy educational manifesto took place via an encrypted global broadcast transmitted simultaneously to every major cultural institution on the planet from our ocean vessel. The presentation utilized advanced holographic rendering to display the structural geometry of our fabrics, showing the world that haute couture was no longer a superficial commodity controlled by high society gatekeepers, but a precise science of human expression and defensive sovereignty that belonged exclusively to those who possessed the courage to master it. The global response to our decentralized manifesto confirmed that we had permanently established our names as the absolute rulers of the modern cultural landscape. The international design community accepting our curriculum as the new golden standard of luxury production. Maxmillian escorted me to the bow of the ship as the broadcast concluded, his hand holding mine with an intense, authentic warmth that signaled the complete resolution of the long war we had waged against the ghosts of our past. Asterisk. We chose to return to our ancestral stone fortress in the Scottish Highlands, to live out the next era of our sovereign covenant in absolute privacy, leaving the operational management of the empire to our synchronized automated networks. We sat in the great hall beneath the historic stone arches, the warmth of the roaring hearth fire illuminating the emerald ring on my finger, realizing that our love had successfully completed its transition from a dangerous survival alliance into a permanent, unshaken state of structural peace. The modern global civilization spends its entire existence running inside a simulated cage of public validation, corporate debt, and emotional vulnerability, believing that happiness is a metric that can be acquired through superficial conformity. They do not understand that the ultimate form of optimization is the absolute capacity to encrypt your personal life, liquidate your adversaries, and walk away from their social matrix entirely on your own terms. We have cleared the ledger. We have deleted our public signatures. The market has closed. The old family ghosts have been permanently compiled, and our runtime environment is now completely flawless.